All right, well, welcome. Well, today we are going to begin the Ten Commandments, and we're going to begin with, of course, the first commandment. So let's start off with a word of prayer. Dear Jesus, we do thank you for your word and for your laws and for your commandments. And God, we pray that today we can have fun, that we can learn a lot about you. And all this we pray, amen. Okay, so as I said, we are getting into the Ten Commandments. Now, one mistake that a lot of people make whenever they hear about God's laws or God's commandments, especially from the Ten Commandments, they think to themselves, man, why does God have all these rules? and wouldn't life just be so much better without them? And the answer is, of course, no. Your life would actually be a lot worse if you were to live in a way that completely contradicted God's laws and God's commandments. You know, a lot of people think that that God is sitting up there in heaven thinking to himself, how can I make sure that Christians don't have any fun? And so he created these laws and these commandments. But actually, if we go by God's ways, if we go by God's laws, then actually one of the things that we find is that God's laws create actually a very fulfilling and a very blessed life. And so you're going to have a lot more fun, and your life's going to be a lot easier and a lot better if you do things God's way. And as we talked about last time, we talked about how God is the one who created everything, so his ways are best. He knows what is best for us. And so he gives us these set of instructions here to live our life. And if we do these things, then our life is going to be life to its fullest. Think about, for example, like lying, for example. Have you ever entangled yourself in a web of lies where you say one lie, and then in order to perpetuate that lie, you have to now say another lie, and then another lie, and then another lie. And then before you know it, you're just buried in this web of lies. And then you have to keep track. It's exhausting. You got to remember, wait, I said this to that person and then another thing to another person. And then whenever they're in the same room together, you don't know what to do. And then you're caught and you're busted. And then people lose trust in you. And if you would just do things God's way, where he says, do not lie, do not give false testimony. That is the eighth commandment, which we're going to talk about later in a few sessions, but really we have to think of it this way, that living God's way is the best way, and he gives us the set of instructions in the Ten Commandments. All right, so if we go back to the Old Testament, the Ten Commandments were given by God to God's people initially through Moses. And so if you guys remember way back in the Old Testament, the book of Exodus, God's people were in slavery in the land of Egypt. Now, this is important because Egypt had their own religion. Now, unfortunately, they did not worship the true living God. Instead, they actually thought that Pharaoh was a god. And so that's why he wasn't just a king. He just wasn't any ruler. He was divine. He was God. And so he was someone who's to be worshiped and treated as such. But also, we have a whole bunch of gods in the Egyptian religion. So we have, for example, it's called polytheism. It's a fancy word to say they had multiple gods. So they had, for example, a god of the harvest, and they had a god of the Nile River there. They had a god of the ocean. They had a god of the sun, and actually the sun god, his name was Ra, and he was worshipped as almost kind of like a supreme deity, if you will. And so if they kind of did have one god that they worship most, it'd be the sun. And that's because if you think about how important the sun is, we take it for granted. We go outside, we see the sun, it provides light of day, but also it provides the ability for crops to grow and really for life to be sustained. And we'd have warmth with the sun as well. If there was no sun, then we would all die. And so the sun god, Ra, was worshipped as kind of like a supreme deity, if you will, a supreme god. But here's the deal. And so you have to remember, so God's people are living in the land of Egypt. Now, they still worship God, and they still had writings, and they still knew about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They absolutely knew about this God, and they worshiped this God. Okay, but they were living in a land of people who were not, who were worshiping other gods. And so this is all very important, because whenever they come out of this land what happens is the first thing that they do after they cross the Red Sea is they go to this mountain, and it's called Mount Sinai, and it's now in what's called the Sinai Peninsula. They're kind of in between Egypt and the Promised Land, in between Egypt and the land of Canaan that God was giving the Hebrews, the Israelites. And so, but they stop at this mountain, and God commands Moses to go to the top of the mountain, and then God gives Moses these 2 tablets. And these 2 tablets here are the 10 Commandments. So God gives Moses these 10 Commandments, these 2 tablets here that have the 10 Commandments on them. And so then what Moses does is he then goes down the mountain, and what does he see? He sees God's people, rather than worshiping the true living God, he sees them actually worshiping a golden calf that they had made. See, they took all their earrings and their jewelry, and they put it all together, and they smelted it, and then created this golden calf. And then they're worshiping the golden calf, saying, hey, this God is the God who rescued us, who delivered us from the land of Egypt. Now, how insane is that? For God the true living God, Yahweh, to exercise the plagues onto Egypt to free them from the land of Egypt, the most powerful nation in the entire world at the time, the biggest army at the time, and one of the most powerful pharaohs. And then to cross the Red Sea on dry land whenever the Red Sea is parted and they get to walk through it and it closes on the Egyptians and Pharaoh's army. Oh my gosh, you would just be amazed by that. How could you not just go and fall on your knees and worship God? Well, they get to the other side, and whenever Moses leaves, they want to worship their foreign gods that they're familiar with hearing about in the land of Egypt. So, pretty big deal. And then, in fact, Moses is so mad that he actually throws down the 2 tablets, and then God actually inflicts some justice and some wrath on his people for that. Moses goes back up to the mountain and then receives version 2.0 of the 10 Commandments, and then comes back down with now the new set of tablets, the 10 Commandments, to give the law to God's people. And so, also, they are leaving a foreign land that has foreign deities, foreign gods, and they are now entering into the land of Canaan, the promised land that God is giving these people. And in this land is also a bunch of foreign gods. You guessed it. In fact, we have the Canaanite gods would be gods like, for example, Baal. And Baal was also kind of like a chief or supreme god, a deity there, and he was worshipped. And whenever they would worship these foreign gods, they would make these idols, they would make these statues, and for Baal, he often represented a ram. And so, in fact, they would take a ram and worship it, or they would even take like the skull of a ram. They would even put it over their own heads as part of their pagan ritual worship. But it wasn't just bowing down and saying, "We worship you, Baal." Instead, what they were doing is they were doing a whole bunch of, well, the way the Bible describes it, a bunch of detestable and abominable things, like cutting themselves and sacrificing children and so forth. In fact, there was actually this one god named the god Molech, and Molech was the statue of him actually had a pot or a center area where they would take human babies and they would put the human babies to be sacrificed and burned alive, and it's very, very, very difficult, very barbaric rituals that took place. And so it's no wonder that the Bible describes these as detestable. Again, it's not just bowing down and saying worship or singing songs. It was a bunch of stuff happened. Let me just say it that way. So if you think about God's people here, they know of the true living God, and they worship this true living God. But they come from the land of Egypt, where there's foreign gods, and then they're going into a land that has foreign gods. So why does God give them these commands? because he wants to be first. In fact, that is the very first commandment. So let's actually get right into it. So the first commandment here, simply put, is this: you shall have no other gods. You shall have no other gods. Not Ra, not Baal, not Molech, no gods. And so what God is commanding his people to do is to not worship any other gods, but to worship God only. Put God first. In fact, that's why it's so ironic that whenever Moses gets down the mountain and he's holding a commandment from God saying, you shall have no other gods. Do not have any other gods. Do not put God below anything else. That's what God is saying here. He sees them bowing down and worshiping this golden calf that they had made. Crazy, right? No wonder Moses got angry and threw down the tablets and had to go back up the mountain and get another round of them, because this is so offensive to God. This is so upsetting to God. And so really, whenever we talk about you shall have no other gods, you shall worship God and God alone, you may say to yourself, okay, well, great, I already do that. So I go to church, we worship God, I praise the name of Jesus, we give each other high fives, and we go home. So check, I totally have this first commandment. I don't struggle with it at all. Well, I hate to break it to you, but it's more than that. It's more than just saying, well, I go to church to worship God, and by the way, I don't go to, let's say, a mosque to worship Allah, or I don't go to a Hindu temple to worship one of the, 330 million gods that exist within Hinduism. So if you say to yourself, okay, well, I don't go to other places to worship other gods, good, that's a starting place, but it's so much more. This commandment applies to our lives and applies to us how we live our life every day. In fact, you can say that all the other 9 commandments are based upon this first one. It's all about putting God first. It's about trusting God with every single moment of every single day and putting him first. And I got to tell you, it's a struggle. It's a struggle for you. It's a struggle for me. It's a struggle for everyone who's a Christian, because we want to put God first, but we have the sinful nature of our flesh, and also the great accuser, Satan, tempting us. And so there's times when we actually have to make difficult choices, and sometimes we choose wrong. So here's what I mean. If we think about this commandment, put God first in everything. Let God be your number one. It's kind of like when I was a kid, we go to the baseball game and I had the big foam finger, number one. That's what God is. To make God number one in your life, we're going to talk about 3 areas that, everyone struggles with. And it's often to put God second, or to put God third, or, maybe he's not even top 10 for you. But here's what I mean. So the first area that we can put God in is the area of our finances. So that is the first blank here. It is the area of our finances, and it's to give a tithe. To give a tithe. So now, a tithe is simply a Hebrew word which means 1/10 or 10%. That's what a tithe means. And so it's literally 10%. So you can't say, well, I'm tithing if you're giving 7%. That's not a tithe. That's, I can't do math, all right? But if you're giving 5%, I could do that kind of math. That's a 20th. So that's not a tithe. A tithe is a 10th. And so what God's people did back then, they were commanded to take their harvest. And so remember, they would grow crops, and these crops, the wheat and barley and so forth, would sustain them all year long, because they had a harvest season in the fall, and then they would plant and then grow throughout the summer. But what they would do is they would take all their harvest, and then they would take a 10th of it. Again, not a 20th of it, but they would take a 10th of it, and then they would take it to the temple, or the tabernacle, depending what part of the Old Testament this is, and then the priests, the Levites, would actually feed off of that throughout their year. And so really, what this does here is it does a couple things. So whenever we talk about giving God a 10th, or whenever we talk about tithing, it's entirely a heart issue. So the first person to give a 10th back in the Old Testament was Abraham. And this is just a really cool story. I'll sum it up real quickly. But Abraham wins a very, very, very miraculous battle. And so he wants to give God thanks. He wants to thank God for blessing him. And so what Abraham does is he takes a tenth of everything that he has, and this priest named Melchizedek shows up, who's a priest from God, and Abraham takes a tenth and then gives it to the priest, gives it to God. And the reason that he did that, he was not commanded to do that, but the reason he gave a tenth was because back then, your taxes were a tenth that you would give to the king. So if you had a harvest, you would take a tenth of it and you would give that to the king. By the way, can I just say, I wish that taxes were only 10% today, okay? But back then, that's what they did. And so Abraham was the first to do it. And what he's saying here, the theological assertion that he is making here is that God, you are my king. God, you are my number one. I'm going to take the first piece that I get. I'm not even going to give it to my earthly king. I'm going to give it to my heavenly king, to God, our perfect Father. And that's what Abraham does. And it shows his heart. It shows his act of worship. And so then later in the Old Testament, in the book of Leviticus, we find out, and also in Exodus, we find out that God is now commanding this tithe. And so that's when he makes it official as a commandment. In fact, here's what it says here in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is kind of like a recap of the first 4 books. And so here's what it says. It says, "You shall tithe all the yield of your seed that comes from the field year by year, and before the Lord your God, in the place that he will choose to make his name dwell there, you shall eat the tithe of your grain, of your wine, and of your oil, and of your firstborn of your herd and flock, that you may learn to fear the Lord your God always." So he is commanding to tithe. Not 5%, but a tenth. And he even gives you the reason. See, this is the thing I love about the Bible. The Bible is not just do it because I said so, but he actually gives a reason. He says that if we tithe, if you notice the last line there, it says that you may learn to fear the Lord your God. How awesome is that? So it goes down to our heart issue. It's a spiritual act of worship. In fact, the reason why we collect offering during a worship service is not because we're pausing worship, we're taking a time out, but rather it's because whenever we give, that is an act of worship. It's an act of sacrifice. And I can tell you, it can be difficult to think about 10% of your income or 10% of the things that you own to give to God. That'd be hard to do. And a lot of people struggle with it. But it is so simple because God is commanding us to do it, because it creates in us an act of worship, and it helps us to revere the name of the Lord. Also, in Malachi, which is another book in the Old Testament, God even says, "Test me on this, and I'll open up the floodgates of blessings on you." So we are promised a blessing in return for tithing. The other thing to note about tithing here is that it's not necessarily always about just whoever can give the most. It's always about the heart. In fact, there's this story in the New Testament, where Jesus is at the temple, and there's some religious leaders throwing in lots of money, and they're doing it in a way to show off. And everyone's looking at them going, "Wow, that person's giving a lot." And then this woman comes up, and all she has is just 2 of the smallest coins. Like today it would be like even less than a penny, but she takes them, and that's all she has. This is everything that this woman has, and she actually puts it into the offering. So she gave not only 10%, she gave 100%, but her 100% was only 2 little coins. And Jesus commends this woman and says, "Surely this woman here has given more than all these other people." And you may say to yourself, "Well, how is that possible? She only gave like 2 pennies. These other people are giving thousands of dollars." And he says, "Well, because she gave everything. And whereas these guys, they didn't. And for her, it's a heart issue." So for God, it's always a heart issue. It's a spiritual act of worship. I can tell you as well, whenever I was in high school, I started a job at Starbucks. And it was super exciting that now I get paid to make and drink frappuccinos. It was incredible. But I remember making $5 an hour, and I remember thinking, wow, if I tithe, that's only like 50 cents an hour that I'm tithing. And really, my first paycheck, I remember looking at it saying, well, should I tithe off of this first paycheck? And I thought to myself, this is me just being real, all right? But I thought to myself, oh, it's only like $10 that I'm going to give to God. Is God really interested in my $10? And then it hit me like a ton of bricks. The answer is yes. Of course he is interested in my $10. Not because it's $10, but because it's my heart. And if I can't even give God $10 at age 16, then how can I be able to give him, well, $100,000 whenever I make $1 million a year someday, whenever that is? It's totally going to happen one day. But that's the deal. It's always a heart issue. So whenever we talk about this area of tithing, a lot of people think that, well, you give money to God or to the church to keep the lights on or to have air conditioning in the building. And I got to tell you, lights and air conditioning are two of my favorite things. But that's not the reason why you give. You give because it is a spiritual act of worship. And you may say to yourself, well, Mike, I'm only in 6th, 7th, or 8th grade. And I say to you, well, that's great. Do you have an income? If you mow your neighbor's yard and you get $20 for it, can you give $2 to God? Absolutely. Whenever you're 16 years old and 17 years old and you're working fast food, can you give God 10%? Absolutely. Whenever you're a millionaire and you're making $1 million a year, can you give God $100,000? Absolutely. Yes, you can, because it's all a heart issue. It's all a spiritual act of worship. And so the reason why I've gone so long on this is because, well, number one, it's commanded by God, and number two, that it's widely misunderstood, and number three, because this is an area that a lot of people struggle with whenever we put God first. See, the first commandment is all about making God your number one, and whenever we have money, suddenly that can become our number one. Suddenly we can become greedy and we can close our fists with the money in our hand and say, this is mine, this is all mine, and I just want to do whatever I want with it. And God is saying, give 10% back to him. And a lot of people will look at that and say, no, I'd rather just hold on to it myself. And what are you doing then? Are you really putting God number one then? No, you're not. So this is a big issue that a lot of people struggle with. Number two here. We can put God first in our relationships. So this one is a huge one for a lot of people as well. People get tripped up. Suddenly God is number one until a relationship comes up, and now God's number two or number three. Let me give you an example of this. I was talking to this high school student a few years ago, and he said that he noticed that over the summer his friends had changed quite a bit. Like, they came back to school and his friends just completely changed, like their attitudes, their clothes, and then the things that they did on weekends. They were very much into the party scene, so they were very much into girls and drinking and marijuana and things of that nature. And so that's what his friends now are doing. And they said, hey, if you want to continue to be friends with us, then you need to come to these parties also, and we want to include you in this. And so for him, all of a sudden, he's at a crossroads. He's got a dilemma at his hands. Either he stays friends with these people and he gets himself in trouble in the party scene, or he has to look at them and say, you know what? We're not friends anymore, and then do the right thing and follow God and live God's way. And whenever people are at that crossroads of having to choose between God and their friend, well, it can be a hard decision for a lot of people. Although if you think of it that way, it should be a very simple decision. It should be a very eye-opening decision to say, you know what? I need to put God first in my life, even if it means losing this friend. And by the way, it's not a good friend anyway. It's just, you're better off without him. You really are. I've seen this with people whenever they get a girlfriend or boyfriend. All of a sudden, they are infatuated with this person, and that person now becomes their number one. Or maybe as well, they choose to engage in behaviors that contradict God's word with their girlfriend or boyfriend. More on that on the sixth commandment. But the deal is that all of a sudden they're now having a truce between God and this relationship. I see it with family members where in order to try to preserve a relationship with a family member, they will abandon God or his word. And so this is another area that we can keep God number one in. The third area to keep God number one is in the area of troubles. Psalm 50 says this, "And call on me in the day of trouble, I will deliver you, and you shall glorify me." Call upon the name of the Lord whenever we're in a time of trouble. You know, I can tell you that whenever bad things happen to people freak out. They just do. I've seen it over and over again. And people will blame God for it. And they'll say, "God, this is your fault." And then they'll get mad at God. And then they want nothing to do with God. And I just got to tell you that just doesn't make any sense, because we have to remember that God is not the author of evil. He's not the one who is inflicting the suffering upon you. That would be Satan. So whatever bad things happen to you, whether it's maybe you have a natural disaster that destroys your home, maybe you have a loved one who gets diagnosed with cancer, maybe you get diagnosed with cancer or some other terminal illness, maybe you are assaulted, okay? All of these things here are all bad things, okay? But to point the finger at God and say, "God, you're the one who did this," that's just simply not true. God is not the one who did that. If you're assaulted, it's the sin of that person who assaulted you. And then it's also Satan who tempted that person to do that. And so, but God's not the one who created that. He's not the one who did that. It's Satan, or it's another person, or both. And so it's interesting that people, first of all, blame God for something that God did not do. Now, God did allow it. That is true. God is in control of everything. In fact, one of the things that we find in the book of Romans is that even though that not everything is God's will, meaning that it's not like if someone gets murdered that God wanted that to happen, okay? But God promises to take everything that happens. He is so good and so loving that he's able to actually orchestrate everything and pull it all together in such a way that he promises that something good is going to come from that for those who love him. So for Christians, he promises that even though that all these bad things are happening, he is able to rework them in such a way that is for our good. Now, we may not see it on this side of heaven. We may not. In fact, one of my favorite stories that Pastor Mike tells, I have to give him credit on this one, is that whenever he was a pastor in Florida, he talked to this guy who was ended up in the hospital with I forget exactly, but some sort of devastating condition. And this person was so confused. Why would God allow me to end up in the hospital? And one of the cool things that happened was that when he was in the hospital, he shared a room with two other guys. And these guys, of course, at this stage, at this point in their life, are asking questions about God or heaven or eternity. And so this person then gets to share the gospel with the other two guys. And those other two guys become believers, and it dawns on this guy, wait, this is why God allowed this bad thing to happen to me, so that I can share the gospel with these other people. Had this not happened, those other people never would have heard the gospel. And now they get to be in heaven with Jesus. And so God promises to take everything and rework it for good for those who love him, so those who are Christians. And so he gives us that promise. So yes, he is in control. He allows things to happen. But we're not going to always see why he allows these things to happen. Sometimes God in his grace will show us, like he did that one guy in the hospital, but sometimes we just will never know. And then whenever we get to heaven, then we'll find out. Oh, now we understand why this happened the way that it did. But here's the other thing too, is that we can run either towards God or away from God in times of troubles. In fact, just recently I got to meet and talk to two different people who were going through the exact same thing. And one person chose to blame God and be angry at God and ran away from God. And then this other person who was going through the exact same thing chose to cling to God and chose to praise God, even though that she's going through something very difficult. and she relied on God for strength and for comfort. And you got to look at that and say it's not the circumstance, it's not the situation that caused this person to turn one way or the other. It was the person, and it was their choice. And so put God first, even in the areas of your troubles. All right, so real quickly, let's turn to the next page here. I want to show you one little quick thing, and this has to do with idols. So whenever we talk about idols were worshiped, foreign gods, pagan gods in the Old Testament. And really, today, we don't have them in statue form, right? Like, most of the time, you're not going to go over to your friend's house and say, oh, hey, before you come into this house, oh, let's just worship this statue that I have here. Let's all bow down and worship the statue. That's probably not going to happen in your lifetime. But we do have idols, figuratively speaking, and here's what I mean. So idols are anything that we make more important than God. Now, idols in the Old Testament were oftentimes man-made statues or structures that people would worship. And today, we don't exactly have it in that form. For example, you're probably not going to go over to a friend's house and say, hey, before you come upstairs, let's all bow down and worship the statue. Probably not going to happen. But idols are definitely real, figuratively speaking, of course. And what I mean by that is this, is that there are things out there that could be okay things, but if we make them to be more important than God, then it has become an idol to us. For example, we talked about tithing with our finances earlier. Well, money for a lot of people is an idol. It is a god for them because their whole purpose in life is just to get lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of money. And by the way, this could be someone who already has lots of money and they just want more of it, or it could be someone who doesn't have very much money and they want more of it. All right, greed can be it does not discriminate. It could be any socioeconomic class. It could be any race, any part of the world. You can be greedy, okay? There's lots of greedy people throughout the world. And really, it's interesting. You talk to people, and sometimes their whole goal in life is just to get more, just get more, just get more money. And then their whole life is just a rat race. Their whole life is empty because they're pursuing something that ultimately is not able to fulfill them. And so that can be an idol. But money itself is not a bad thing. In fact, money is kind of, think of it like a brick. It can be used for good things and bad things. A brick can be used to build a building, but it can also be used to destroy a building. Kind of interesting. Money, similarly, can be used for very great and godly purposes, but can also be used for ungodly purposes. And then the love of money, according to James, is the root of all kinds of evil. So an idol is anything that we make to be more important than God. So therefore, to close with this, the bottom line is to worship only God. Worship only God. So there you go. We have the first commandment, you shall worship no other gods. And then we are going to get into, you guys said the second, third, fourth, all the way through the 10th commandment. So thanks for joining us today.